everyone, this is Danielle. I'm recording a video on source integration and MLA. This one is meant to address what I call orphan and hit and run quotations, which is how we go about integrating our evidence and ensuring we're integrating it with our voice and also providing adequate analysis after it. I'm first just going to briefly talk about writing styles in general, and I have my final draft of the version here, but I also have my draft version, which doesn't it's not finalized. This version, I don't know why I actually kept this version, but this one will allow me to actually type in it. If when we talk about what MLA and APA actually are, we're saying, and you may have heard this before, but what they are actually called writing styles. And if we say, like, well, what's a writing style? So a writing style is it determines format. That's a reductionist perspective, but it determines how one approaches writing and formatting. I should say writing style, evidence integration, and formatting in a particular discipline. Um, and sometimes they're called writing guides, but a writing guide is slightly different from a writing style. A writing guide is usually like a modification of a writing style, often seen in journals where if you're like publishing a peer-reviewed article, they'll usually have each journal will have its own writing guide where it's like, okay, you need to, and then do these things in order for us to even look at it, and it has to follow certain rules. And oftentimes it'll be like, okay, this is based on the Chicago writing style or Chicago Turabian writing style, but they make a few adjustments for whatever purposes they deem. So that's what a writing style is. It's based on the discipline. And so there's a huge truckload of writing styles. MLA and APA are just the most common because they're the most commonly used in university settings. So it's not until you get up into either upper level courses that might be really nuanced, like maybe like the other one that might be most common in like an undergraduate setting is IEEE, which is engineering, or even like the computer science field, like they might use IEEE, but that other than that, until you get into like graduate level work or more advanced like academic advanced studies, then that's when you start getting into like really explicit, and we're talking every field, like whatever it is, anthropology, biology, chemistry, like they all have their own writing styles. It's a nightmare. So just working with MLA and APA, it's like, okay, that's easy enough. And then as somebody who ran a writing center for 7 years for a school of 60,000 students, you have people coming in from every disciplines, and they're like, I'm working on this with this writing style, and you're like, oh god, I've never heard of that one, it's another one. So you're constantly learning these new writing styles, and then you have to kind of figure it out and learn it and help them with it. So in terms of when we talk about MLA and APA, and what I think is a little bit more difficult, Embry-Riddle's working hard because they had to fight for MLA to be in Humanities 142, and I think it's really good that MLA is in 142 because it makes zero sense for APA to be taught in a literature course. If you understand the literature, the discipline of literature, zero sense for APA to be used as a writing style. I understand that it may not make sense to anybody else unless you really understand like how literature is used in argument, like when we write it. But MLA, or the Modern Language Association, it's a humanities-based writing style, APA, the American Psychological Association, is a social sciences um, writing style. And one of the primary differences is direct quotation versus paraphrase and summary. So MLA, it's all about direct quotation, which in my opinion is a much easier way of writing. Paraphrase is actually cognitively a much more difficult writing practice than direct quotation. To be able to concisely and clearly and accurately paraphrase takes real skill and a real understanding, sometimes of really complex ideas. And it's not just changing a word here or there. It's the practice of, if you've ever heard, like reading something, turn it over and rewrite what that person said in your own words. That's what true paraphrase is, by not trying to remember what they said, trying to remember the core idea of what they're trying to communicate. So that's why I think paraphrase is more difficult. The reason I said Embry-Riddle is it makes it a little bit more difficult is because before I came to Embry-Riddle, I was at like I said, a public university for a long time, and I've taught composition classes along with literature for many, many years. And, I've never taught comp that didn't, sorry, I can't type, that didn't use MLA. So for me, it's very unusual when I first came to Embry-Riddle and I saw that English 106 and English 123 were using APA. That's very unusual because writing is a humanities-based course. And so to throw APA in those and then to say, it's good to learn APA early, although, again, I think you do have source integration that's more difficult to do. And there's other things that's slightly more difficult, but then to say, okay, now I'm going to take Humanities 142 or another or a different literature class where it uses MLA, where you're going, and this isn't unusual. It happens in all universities where students are sometimes taking classes where they're writing in different writing styles at the same time, or they've taken courses in one writing style and then they have to switch to another writing style. But so I think I mean, I'm used to teaching the comp in APA now. I just think it's a little strange. So, because it's not normal. But it is good to learn MLA, because I always think comparative learning is good, so you can see, and it also gives you an idea, right? This is how MLA does it versus this is how APA does it. It just, in theory, should help you learn the other one better. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking about that because I could talk about that for far too long. So let me get into actually what are orphans and hit and runs, because you're going to hear me use these, and I've already used them in some of my feedback already. So an orphan quotation is, and I'm not going to go through everything here, and I do have examples on this document that I'll try to go through. But an orphan quotation is a quotation that's not accompanied by a signpost. So a signpost is that bit of information that's written by you to introduce a quotation, and it's usually contextual information that helps the reader to understand what's introducing the quotation. And then I just give the quotation from how MLA defines what signposts are. Excuse me. So, and it's called a signpost because that's a metaphor, but that's what it's meant to do if you think about a signpost on a road, like pointing you in the right direction of a town or a city, right? Like Chicago, 190 miles that way, right? Like that's what it's doing. It's pointing the reader in the right direction. So it's the metaphor is dead on. It's that's what it's supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be pointing the reader in a very particular direction. If you're lacking a signpost, which I have in this example here from a story that you'll read, A Rose for Emily, or I can't remember if you have read it all in this week. I'm getting my modules messed up. But you can see, and I've bolded the quotation, but you can see that the period comes here, right? And then there's just this quotation. So this has no signpost. There's no leading the reader in a certain direction. It's just, here's a quotation, reader. Have fun with it. So the reader really has no idea what to do with this. It's not the writer's voice. It's Faulkner's narrative voice. You know, the writer is not correct in saying it's described by the author. We never talk about literature like that. We always say it's described by the narrator, or if it's in first person, right? Depending, we haven't gotten a narrative mode yet. But we always, it's not, and that has to do with the verb tenses that we use when we write about literature. But we don't want to conflate the author with the narrator. And so that's also what this person was doing here. But this has no signpost. So it's just left there on its own. And that's why we call it an orphan. It's like it has no mom or dad, right? Essentially, it has no parental, and it has no guardian. So the orphan and the hit and run are also functioning as metaphors. So to move on, I provide an example of how to eliminate the orphan quotation by adding the signposts before the quotation. So this, and I say this will help the reader understand the purpose and context of the quotation. Forgot this was a PDF. All right, here we go. So I rewrote this, and you can see it's much different. It's much different. It's very different. And just to, okay, I don't like making the PDFs always work weird when they're in full screen. Okay. Just as a reminder, this was the original one. So in William Faulkner's short story, A Rose for Emily, the house was described by the author. And then there's the quotation with the page number. So again, I use that same introductory phrase in William Faulkner's short story, A Rose for Emily. The narrator describes the protagonists. I identify the protagonist's house. The description represents how the deteriorating house parallels the deteriorating culture of the post-antebellum South. The narrator writes, and then I'm bolding the signpost in this case. The narrator, I actually should probably bold all of this, because all of this is really lead-in to the quotation, because I'm trying to, if you think about music and progression and build up, it's the same thing we do in writing. We kind of layer on, and then there's this kind of you build up, and so you're preparing the reader for something. But that's what I'm doing here. I'm not just going to drop something in the reader's lap and be like, enjoy, and then walk away, right? So I mean, that would be nice. And in fact, I shouldn't make fun of that, because that is how writing is done in some countries. What I'm talking about is what's done in what's called American academic English. It's a very hand-holdy, um, I actually call it the dumb reader. We have to do everything for the reader. So, but the very explicit signpost here is the narrator writes that the house is a, and then I give that quotation, big squares, blah, 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 and then the in-text citation with just the page number there. It's only italicized for the sake of the handout. Otherwise, it wouldn't be italicized. So, and you'll also notice that I took out it was a, and I put the quotation mark in front of big, because there's something called, and this is going back to, well, first, when I say if I've ever given you in feedback, like, think about your quotation. Does every single word in that quotation have to be there? Okay, does it have to be there? No. Does was have to be there? No. Does a have to be there? No. These are very minor words that have nothing to do, that help to describe what Emily Gerson's house looks like. So I said, I don't need those words, because we just need the bit of the quotation, and the shorter the better, because that's going to help your reader grasp on, your dumb reader grasp on to what you're saying more quickly and more easily. They're going to get their grapples on it. So what I did here is I just started the quotation at big, because this is the most important part of the quotation. And what I also did is I changed the tense to proper MLA, which is actually what's called literary present. And I'll talk about literary present and historical past in a second. But you'll notice that or hopefully you'll notice that I'm using all present tense here. The narrator describes. The description represents. It parallels. The narrator writes. The house is. Everything is present tense. It's literary present, because in literature, it's super corny and cheesy sounding. But in literature, in the discipline, and this is MLA, very proper MLA, we write in the literary present when we're writing about a text, because in literature, the text is never historical. It's never in the past. It's always in the present, because it's always being interpreted. It's like an always already. It's always already happening. Like, it never is in the past. I wouldn't say the narrator wrote that the house, because that makes no sense. Because the text is something that I'm reading. It's an active process of of experience and being. So that's literary present versus, for example, well, I won't say for example. I'll get back to how we write in verb tenses in MLA in just a second. So what I said here is basically what I did is I fully integrated the quote from A Rose from Emily with the writer's voice. I bolded the signposts. It's a smoother introduction to the quotation. It's also contextually helps. It makes sense, whereas before it was just like, hey, there's this story. Have a present. That's a quotation. And I'm not going to give you any context for it. I write that smoother intros and transitions help with the flow of writing. And an additional sentence was also added. That was... I'm writing in the passive voice there. This is a very APA style of writing. Was also added. I should write, I also wrote an additional sentence to get rid of that passive voice, but whatever. Before the signpost as a means to, I don't need to. That's wordy writing, because that's a prepositional phrase that I don't need. Before the signpost to provide further contextual information to help the reader understand the specific purpose of the evidence. Or I could say to understand the specific evidentiary purpose, right? Okay, I am literally editing myself as I read this, and this is my daily anxiety. So, um, but that's how trying to explain what I'm doing up here. Okay. And then I give some additional minor changes that I did. I said that I eliminated the passive voice, which I should do in my own writing. It's a long time frustration that I have with my own writing. And I explained what that means. Again, I say here what I said before, don't conflate the author with the narrator. And then I talked more about passive voice and how that's achieved, which has to do with the position, or what we would call the syntactical placement of the subject and the object in the sentence, right? The house is the object, the author is the subject, right? So I talk about like how I grammatically or syntactically changed that. Okay, so that's, if I say you have an orphan quotation, that's what I mean. Now, sometimes students can have orphans and not hit and runs. Sometimes they can have just hit and runs. Sometimes they can have an orphan and a hit and run. This is an orphan and a hit and run. But, so I'm going to actually just move on to hit and run, but I do use a different, I move into Poe, Edgar Allan Poe as an example here. So what is a hit and run quotation? So a hit and run quotation is kind of what I've been alluding to in a variety of metaphors as something that's just dropped into paper and then you just kind of walk away from it, you leave. So, I mean, it's kind of an aggressive metaphor, like a hit and run. Like if you think about a car hitting another car and then the car just driving away. I mean, that is the metaphor. I don't like to think about it as a car hitting a person because that's a bad thing to think about. But that's the idea, is that the culprit who's responsible for the thing leaves the scene and doesn't provide any help or explanation. So you as the writer are culpable, meaning you're responsible for explanations and doing the work and things like that. So if you bring in a secondary voice, which is a big deal in writing because it's your voice, it's your paper, it's your name on it, and you bring in, evidence from the text, which you're supposed to be doing, so you're doing the right thing by doing that. But then if you don't explicitly address that evidence, the quotations, to justify why it's there and what it's doing for the overall argument, then you have a hit and run quotation. So, and this is very common because in order to do hit and run, or in order to do effective, in order to do this, you have to be comfortable with analysis. And analysis is the most difficult thing to do. But before anything else, you have to have an argument. And if you don't have an argument, you can't do analysis. So right out of the bat, that 3-step model, it's all kind of like you can't have one without the other. Like, yeah, you can have, it's like if you don't have an argument, you're not going to win at analysis because you have nothing to point back to. And then if you don't have an argument, what is your evidence doing? Because you have no reason to bring in any evidence. So without that first part of the 3-step model, it's like you're just, if you haven't succeeded at that first step, step 2 is going to be a problem, and step 3 is definitely going to be a problem. So this one is a slightly longer example because we're getting into analysis, which is more difficult to explain than here's how to write a signpost, which is in my opinion, much more easy to explain. But in this particular example, is, you know, needed a lot of work. But just an example, I am going to read it because I think it's important to understand how to do analysis. And what I've given to what a type of feedback that I've given to a lot of students is that when we talk about evidence, we're really talking about two things. We're talking about integration and we're talking about analysis, but that's all in the second step. You have to do evidence of the quotation. And then after you've done that, then you move on to the third step of the model, because then you have to do holistic analysis. You have to do a full blown, like, okay, what does all of this mean then? Like you've talked about, you've analyzed the evidence in context of this quotation in terms of the argument. Now, how does that connect in the overall sense of whatever it is you're trying to say? So it's a nuanced practice. But anyways, this is from Poe's The Telltale Heart. The narrator had been planning to kill the old man for 8 days, as he stated. And here's a quotation. Again, you can see there's two quotations here. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. He killed the old man by smothering him with his bed. Which isn't true. After he kills the old man and he dismembers the body and discards the body underneath the floorboards. It's a fragment. Even after the man was no longer alive, the narrator reveals how crazy his character was in the story. The guilt of killing the old man began. I'm stopping because I've always gotten a lot of questions from students about repetition of language. There's good repetition and then there's overkill of repetition. There's definitely overkill of old man. There's indication that there's definite revision that could be done in terms of revising there's just so much work that could be done here. The guilt of killing the old man began to haunt him, as he stated. It was a low stifled sound that rises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged. Didn't fully finish that spelling. With awe. The night he killed the old man, sounds were heard by the neighbors. They reported the sounds to police. Note that this is getting into exposition and not analysis. So we're now moving into reader response genre, which is not the correct genre for this type of writing. The police enter the home old the man. Don't know. They searched around and found no evidence of the old man, but the guilt that hunted the main character made him confess the murder of the old man. Okay. So, yeah. A lot of things to discuss there, but I'm just going to focus on the quotations. So when discussing hit and run quotations, we're looking for what comes after. So for the signposts, it's usually before. Some people will ask, well, I want to put the signpost after the quotation. Fine, put the signpost after the quotation. I personally don't like signposts after quotations because you still given a quotation and it's like, what are you doing? And then it's like you get after the quotation and then there's contextual information and then it's like, oh, okay. I just think it's not as effective writing, but it can be. It's just, I think, a little bit more complicated or more difficult. But when hit and runs, we're looking for what's after the direct quotation. So, and then I talk specifically about the first quotation discusses how the narrator enters the bedroom of the old man. What comes after the quotation does not refer to this. Right? So the quotation is, upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. And then what comes after that is, he killed the old man by smothering. This is that exposition type of writing that, let me tell you what happened in the story. That's not analysis. I don't need to know what happened in the story. I only need to know what happened in the story for contextual, as needed basis only. Tell me what happens in the context so I understand the quotation. Or I understand in the analysis of how this connects to your argument. I don't need to know any of this information, right? Because it's all just, this is what happened in the story. None of that's analysis, right? I said instead, right? And that's just what I said. Moves on to discuss what happens next in the story. the narrative, excuse me. I said, likewise, in the second quotation, or the second quotation discusses sounds the narrator hears and feels when standing in the old man's bedroom, and what comes after this quotation has nothing to do with what is in that quotation. This is why these are hit and run quotations. The writer has dropped in the two quotations without explicitly referring to the quotations to explain how they are working for the paper's overall argument. So that's what hit and run quotations are. It's just, here's some stuff from the text, and then I'm just going to go on and talk. So they're very common. I don't want it to come across like I'm making fun of these writers. It's not, doing analysis is not simple when you're doing textual analysis of evidence. I consider source integration and analysis of evidence of source integration to be one of the most difficult things to do in writing. Especially because there's so many ways to go about doing it, and it's so easy to forget something. Or it's so easy to quickly go in the wrong direction or just take that wrong step to the left rather than to the right. And so for me, it's a really tricky, like it's a little bit of a tango. So I don't want it to come across. I don't want this to come across that I'm the purpose of me recording this video is to emphasize the fact that I know this is difficult work, and that's why I'm recording it, so I could talk about it a little bit more. So just like I did with orphans, I talk about how to eliminate hit and run quotations. You can see that the writing is much longer than what was above. You could also see that I added a different quotation, a different second quotation than the one that was chosen here. And that's because I was not convinced that this was the proper quotation, an appropriate evidence, an appropriate piece of evidence to bring in. So I'm just going to read through this and we'll see if we can, the yellow is the analysis. So the yellow is me saying, here's where I'm talking about, I'm referring directly back to the evidence. This is what we call that recursivity. We're going that back and forth. So I can explain to the reader what this evidence is doing. Why is it here? So the narrator had been planning to kill the old man for 8 days, and when the 8th night came, the narrator was more than usually cautious in opening the door. The narrator's description that he was more than usually cautious upon entering the bedroom of the old man heightens the suspense of the murder to come. After cautiously entering, the narrator kills the old man, dismembers the body, and discards the body parts beneath the floorboards. While the theme of death could be a predominant theme of Poe's The Telltale Heart, the theme of guilt prevails because the death of the old man elicits the even more haunting guilt that results in the narrator's full descent into madness and the denouement of the short story. The theme of guilt haunts the narrator mostly via sounds, particularly the phantom beating of the old man's heart beneath the floorboards. After the officers arrive to investigate sounds reported by the neighbors, the phantom beating of the telltale heart haunts the narrator. Toward the end of the story, he exclaims to himself, "Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder." This quotation evidences the increasing guilt in the narrator. He tries to quiet the sounds of the beating heart by swinging in the chair and grating it on the floorboards, but this does not work. Notably, the theme of guilt is augmented by Poe's writing as seen in this quotation. The increased use of dashes and the short declarative phrases such as "I foamed," "I raved," "I swore" reflect the overwhelming guilt of the narrator. The sound is all-consuming to the point that the narrator can no longer think in complete thoughts. Like the cautious opening of the door during the silent eighth night, the loudness of the beating heart builds suspense until it erupts and then collapses as the narrator gives in and confesses to the officers. Okay. And I remember when I rewrote this, revised this paragraph, it was really hard. It was hard trying to take this and make sense out of it. But I feel like I did. I did a decent job because I kept a lot of what was in the original paragraph, and I just elaborated on it. And I hope that it's clear how, especially in the highlighted bits, that how I'm directly referencing, right? And by directly referencing, I'm saying like I'm quoting things again from the quotation and down here, right? I'm saying again, he's doing this in the quotation. He's swinging chairs and grating it on the floorboard. I talk about the writing style itself. There's increased use of dashes. There's short declarative phrases. I give the phrases and I explain what that does in relationship to the theme. So that's analysis of evidence. And then I go on, and then this part would be like that third part of step 3 of the model. So it's not just about this piece of evidence. It's the overall, let me talk about the overall argument of the paragraph and kind of close it out. Everything that's here, this is just an explanation of pretty much what I just said, what I've already stated. The only thing I haven't said is this is formatted like this because it's a block quotation, meaning it's a long quotation. So, and it's a long quotation, and do I still have it open? Okay. Actually, that shouldn't be a long quotation. I wonder why I do have it a long quotation. I'll have to double check MLA on that. Yeah. But this is a long quotation. I'm doubting my own work here. But again, I'm being self-critical. But I'm not going to talk about short and long quotations in this because I do want to get briefly to. You can see these little in-text citations. In-text citations in MLA are much easier to talk about than an APA. And then the last thing I talk about are minor changes that I did in that longer excerpt that I did. I provided improved signposts. I did a lot of editing for concision. Like before, I was saying there's wordiness, there's fragments, there was repetition, and obviously the length of analysis. And then an important rule here that I also note, and I said, while the original excerpt provided no analysis of its quotations, the length of analyses is important to note. Because the rule of thumb, and I've given this note just a few times to students, but not often, because I always say, like, the shorter the better. But there are times when we do need a longer quotation. Like, there are reasons behind it. For how much analysis to do, and this is in that part 2 of the 3-step model, right? Of the evidence, that integration portion and the analysis of the evidence is dictated by the length of the evidence itself. A shorter quotation needs less analysis, whereas obviously a longer quotation needs more analysis. It's just common sense. If you give me a 100-word quotation and a 1-sentence analysis, obviously that's a problem. That's called source dependency. That's a different issue. The writer's analysis of evidence should always be at least as long, if not longer, than the evidence. So yeah, and that's in order to balance your voice because you don't want to fall into the territory of source dependency. So you always want your voice to be the dominant voice. So if you start crowding your paper with all this evidence and you're not doing sufficient analysis, then you're falling into, I don't know what to say, so I'm just depending on my sources to say it for me, and then it's no longer a paper. It's just a kind of stringing together of sources, and the reader doesn't really know what to do with that. So, but that's source dependency. That's a slightly different issue. But that's the kind of main thrust of one of the reasons for that rule. So, just to, I did want to point out, MLA. I have given this link before, and I'll put it in the announcement again. But this is if you don't have the MLA handbook, this is the website you want to use for MLA information, which is the OWL at Purdue. OWL stands for Online Writing Lab. It's like considered the next best thing. It's not. It just isn't as comprehensive. It just doesn't have as much as the entire manual, but it is like basically the manual. And it's an incredibly credible site. So, and the site I'm on right now or the page I'm on right now is in-text citations, the basics. So, just, you could see here, and this is why I say that, let me make that a little bit bigger. Oh, that's too big. And this is why I say that MLA in-text citations are easier than APA, because when you're in APA, you've got punctuation in your in-text citations. Oftentimes you've got, if you don't have anything in the signposts, or if you're not just doing author parenthetical year, right, then you've got an in-text citation that's got author or authors' last names, if not that, a title, a year, or n dot d dot, and then a p dot for page or a paradot for a paragraph number, right? So you've got all this information separated by commas. It's a lot of information to put. You can see here we've got a last name and a page number, and that's it. Now, this does get more complicated when we get into poetry, and I have a specific document on that, and I'll record a video specifically when we get to poetry, because this is specific to just quoting page numbers, which is the most common thing. But when we get to poetry, you cite by line numbers, and when we quote drama, like Shakespeare, you quote by act, scene, line. Doesn't matter what the page number is. I want to know, is it act 3, scene 3, line 85 through 89? I don't care what the page number is. That doesn't tell me anything. And that's because all dramatic texts or plays, we call them dramatic texts, are uniform. So if you say it's act 3, scene 2, line 96, I could pick up any version of that text, go to that exact act 3, scene 2, whatever I said, and it would be there. So that's why we cite drama that way. Same thing with poetry. It's this poem, it's line 12. Okay, I look for that poem, look for line 12, doesn't matter what book it's in. So that's why we cite poetry that way as well. So, but for what we're doing right now, with the exception of Jekyll and Hyde, which is an HTML document, therefore, and we don't use any. We would only say like Stevenson, right? We would only use the last name for it. So I'm just going to, if I have that document open, which I do, I'm just going to go to the end of this document here. So MLA in-text citations, it's just last name, page number. That's all it is. And I can tell you, uh, I should cite this for prose. That just means for everything except for poetry and drama. So everything we're reading, Jekyll and Hyde, or I'm leaving Jekyll and Hyde out. Sorry. All the short stories, that's all just prose. There's only two types of writing: prose and poetry. So everything we're reading right now is prose. Um, so that just means it's a last name, page number, and that's it. And it's the page number of your text. So I'm not going to talk about in-text citations, but if you're curious, or not in-text citation, the works cited reference page, you would be citing a piece in an anthology if you're looking for the formula. So that would be the type of thing you're citing on your works cited page. And unlike APA, we do work and works, depending on if you have one or more. APA is only references. So there is a difference in that. So if you're just citing the one story or just one thing, you would say it's just one work rather than multiple. Whereas APA, it's always plural. So there's really, and I'm just going to say that because I could say like, well, if there's no author, then you would use the title. And what does that look like? But we're always going to have an author. So there's really no need to get into that. But I do really, the last thing I'm going to talk about here is those verb tenses. And like I said, we have the literary present and the historical past. And this is what and just for comparison, verb tense, past. That's it. Okay. So, and I just wanted to, you can see here they're giving some additional writing styles. There's IEEE, AMA. So this here is the in-text citation. I thought their choice of examples was interesting because they're all in the historical past. So, and I wanted to just use that. So I'm just going to grab that. I think these two are actually good examples because that's the other thing that I'm missing from. Yeah, it's going to put them in a video. Oh, that's not bad. Put everything like that. There we go. That's a little bit better. Except we have tick marks instead of quotation marks. That is a big pet peeve of mine. Anytime you do copy paste, you want to change tick marks to quotation marks. Okay. So this also gives me another place to talk about signposts and in-text citations. So literary present, and I'll actually pull from because I have one of these student examples here that I provided. And I can easily just grab, here's a quotation. You see tick marks here. Tick marks. They drive me up the wall. Quotation marks, good. And then when they're intermixed together, it's like, ah! Somebody's trying to drive me crazy. Oh, I'm actually gonna grab this one. This one is actually missing. Oh, yeah, this is an example of a signpost that comes after. I was saying how I'm not a big fan of that. I'm not. But each their own. I'm not gonna like give you a bad grade because you do it. It's just do it well. Get rid of these tick marks. They are not correct. That is actually against MLA and APA. Okay. So, literary present, like I said before, is the text itself is a living document. It's never in the past, so it's always happening. Because when we read it and when we talk about it, it's always happening. It's a weird theoretical kind of concept. I don't know how to explain it without explaining like theoretical concepts. So, which is make this video probably more boring and long than it already is. But just to so again, this student, it's not the most exciting signpost, but they have a signpost, and they are also using the literary present here. Now, I did say before that we don't like to conflate the author with the narrator, but that's not what the student is doing in this case, because here they are speaking very explicitly about a literary technique that Jackson chose to do, which is using an objective point of view. And then they're providing an example of an objective point of view. So it's okay that this person is saying Jackson uses an objective point of view. I'm not sure uses is the best verb. Obviously, there's always room for improvement. So in terms of, but this is grammatically correct, the signpost, the she writes, the comma, and then the quotation. The reason, in this case, there's another rule of thumb that's like it's better to oversight than undersight. So this person is oversighting because they have Jackson in the signpost and then they have Jackson again in the in-text citation. Jackson is actually not needed here because the reason the period comes after the in-text citation is this whole thing is considered like one giant, like if I could bracket it, like it's considered like one whole entity. And so you don't MLA wise need Jackson there and Jackson there. But again, oversighting is better than undersighting. So if you're ever nervous, like, do I need Jackson in both places? You can do that. It's just that you don't have to do that, but the page number is needed. So, and they're doing the grammar correctly with, this would be wrong, right? The period goes after the in-text citation because that in-text citation is part of this full entity. With and the literary present is that present tense there, right? Because they're specifically talking about the text. So they need it's not she wrote, it's she writes, even though, Jackson, I think she's dead. I'm pretty sure she's dead. And the text is quite old, not significantly old. It's, mid 20th century. I was like mid 19th century. I was getting my centuries mixed up. Next one You should have seen how wisely with I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. Quotation and tick mark is just the start of a crazy person's rant. Okay. My only thing that I don't like is that this is just informal. They do a good job putting crazy in quotation marks. That's the right thing to do. I probably told them to do that. But is just the start, that's a little informal. It's a little teetering on idiomatic. But grammatically it's correct. And the in-text citation is correct. And that's because, and like I said, when we talk about does the quotation grammatically flow, yes. I went to work is just the start of a crazy person's rant, right? It's like, yeah, that makes sense. There's no grammar that's needed. And then they chose to put it's not a signpost, but they're giving some type of, I mean, it's kind of a signpost, but it's not really a signpost so much as contextual information, which a signpost can be, but here, in this case, it's not acting as a signpost. It's just acting as, contextual information. And then they're doing this correctly by adding Poe's last name and the page number, no punctuation necessary, and that's correct. And also because there's no the name, the last name is needed here because it's nowhere else. And again, that's the present tense, and that's correct because again, this is talking explicitly about the text itself. So that's the literary present. It's when we're using verbs, because again, literary present and historical past is what we're talking about. We're talking about MLA verb tenses. I know, super exciting topic. I actually love it. But there is a difference between when we write an APA where you're only writing in past tense versus when you're writing an MLA. And that's because we're writing in a different discipline. We're writing specifically about literature, which are considered living documents. So when we're quoting the text, when we're talking about the text, the verbs have to be in present. So when do we use the historical past? We use historical past when we're not talking about the text, right? And MLA did me a nice job and gave me examples that were in the historical past. So they're using the poet Wordsworth here. But they've done a great job by, here's some examples of in-text citations. But, the verbs are in the historical past. This one is not in the historical past, which is really weird. Whew. So yeah, but this one is. Okay. I've lied. Okay. So, but this is so weird. Okay, sorry. So the difference here is, and I can give you, but this will, no, I'm just gonna, no. Oh, okay. Wordsworth stated, right, past tense. He's a writer, right? He's a poet, very famous. That romantic poetry was marked by a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, right? That has nothing to do with the text. This is just talking about what Wordsworth had to say about romantic poetry. So it's stated and it was marked. So we have two past tense verbs here. That's historical past. Nothing about a text, nothing about a poem that Wordsworth wrote, nothing about any literary criticism he wrote. Just this is what he said about romantic poetry. Romantic poetry, capital R, because it's a genre. This is, sorry I grabbed it, but this is characterized by, I don't know why they changed. I'm just gonna, it's literary present because they're talking about the texts. That's why it's literally present here, even though it's the same quotation. Because they've moved the words around, they've changed the meaning of the sentence, which is why it's now literary present instead of historical past. So I was going to say was characterizing. It's not a was. It's not a historical past, because if you say romantic poetry was characterized, that makes absolutely no sense, because romantic poetry is a genre of texts, a genre of living documents that exists today. So it has to be in literary present. So that's why it is. So that's very interesting that they're using the same quotation. They've just changed it because they want to show the use of Wordsworth being used in the signpost and just the page number being used in the in-text citation, or what we might call the parenthetical citation, versus no Wordsworth being mentioned except in that in-text citation / parenthetical. So because they did that, they actually changed the verb tense in MLA from historical past to literary present. Um, so that's the difference between the MLA verb tenses. So if you ever see me say, like, I am going to start harping on it a little bit. I haven't yet, because I'm trying to just harp on like a few things at a time. Not harp, but like get you to notice things a little bit at a time, rather than be like, here's 800 things I need you to focus on. Like, that's not my job. My job is to get, start noticing things slowly. But this is an MLA prescription, and it is important, in when we're writing about literature, that we recognize them as living artifacts that continue to exist in this weird theoretical state of being, and how we relationally connect with them when we're reading them, in terms of the mind body existence, like that. Like I said, it comes out of a theoretical, um, you know, to be and I, and that type of theory. So, yeah, because everything literature has to be really weird and that type of stuff. So, anyways, this video has gone on forever, but I've addressed a lot of things. I've talked about orphan quotations, hit and run quotations. I've talked about signposts. I've mentioned the owl at Purdue. I've gone over in-text citations and MLA. I've talked about verb tenses and MLA. I don't know. I've talked about such a mishmash of stuff. But hopefully this video is of some use in some way. But this is all in service of working on evidence integration. So that's it for now. I will be continuing to talk about MLA in the future.